State Assemblies. It was known as the Women's Lawyer Bill. And involved in that effort with her was Mrs. Sarah Knox Goodrich, another incredible woman. Laura Watkins, who I may have mentioned already, was also involved. The four of them, in fact, went to Sacramento together. Mrs. Goodrich's experience should be recounted because here we get the whole organization, the way the mind was working at the time. They were first invited to have a float in the 4th of July parade in 1872. And they did. This was the women's suffrage groups of the county. 1876, they also wanted to have it to be involved. That, of course, was the centennial celebration of the United States. And so it was very appropriate. She had a beautiful home at the corner of 2nd and San Antonio, which was where the parade would pass, up 2nd Street and down San Antonio, probably down 1st Street, I'm guessing, I don't know. But she plastered all kinds of slogans up on this beautiful house. Taxation without representation is tyranny, as much in 1876 as it was in 1776. We are denied the ballot but compelled to pay taxes. Governments derive their just power from the consent of the governed. Also, she had a float where the slogan was, "We are governed without our consent." And she says in a letter to Mrs. This letter is included in the history of the suffrage movement. On the evening of July 3rd, Mrs. Knox writes, Mrs. Goodrich, "As we have had all our preparations completed, we sent to one of the marshals and asked him to give us a place in the procession next to the Negroes, as we wish to let our legal protectors have a practical illustration of the position occupied by their mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters in this boasted republic. We did not want to go in, however, ahead of the Chinamen, as we consider our position at present to be between the two." So, I think if you study this parade, you would study the social relationships of the entire Santa Clara County. Eventually, they were put up in back of the pioneers. You see, the pioneers, the white Protestant pioneers led the parade, the women came behind and so forth. If I were to summarize these women who worked on behalf of the rights movement, well, I think I've done it already. I should mention two, however, just in passing, who epitomize all of the values that I've been talking about to a tremendous degree. And one of them, of course, Mrs. Jane Stanford and Mrs. Phoebe Apperson Hearst. What would happen if you gave one of these reforming women, any one of them, unlimited wealth? What do you think they would do with the money? Well, we know, because we have Mrs. Stanford and we have Mrs. Hearst. One gave everything she had, almost everything, to establish a university which did allow women in as students from the very beginning, although there was a limit of 500 at first. And Mrs. Hearst gave all of her money to University of California. But they also gave tremendous amounts of money to the women's suffrage effort, to establishing kindergartens all over the United States, to establishing charitable institutions like women's hospitals and a school for girls in Washington, D.C., and academies for women to study at all over the United States. In fact, it is a remarkable testament to the spirit of these women of the 19th century that there is so much that you can look to, you can point to and say, if it weren't for them, these two women, this would not have been done. I think most of us don't realize that the University of California, the first patron was the state, the second patron was Mrs. Hearst. If you walk along the buildings there, you can see her name on almost every other building. Well, she personally gave the money to build this building, and that was particularly for women's education. So they put their money where their beliefs were. And there was quite a correspondence between Susan B. Anthony, Mrs. Stanford, and Mrs. Hearst. They all knew one another very well. In fact, Mrs. Stanford hosted a party of 800 women in Washington, D.C. at her home. Her husband, as you know, was a senator. In honor of the women's suffrage effort. 800 women, they were the leaders of the women's effort from across the United States, and apparently not one person turned down the invitation. I think to summarize this whole effort, I'd like to give you the contents of a pamphlet that was written in 1896, to which actually Mark Twain contributed a very interesting paragraph, but it summarizes all of the attitudes that were used, or the rhetoric, I should say, which was used to convince men that they ought to share the power with women. And high up on the list was that women were competing with Asians for jobs. Now, the Asian males had the right to vote, but the women did not have the right to vote. And furthermore, suffrage brings no evils, only good. Women would make better mothers because their outlook is enlarged, makes the home a happier place because they've sharpened intelligence and their intellectual companions to their husbands. By giving women the vote, we would protect women legally, prevent destructive wars, and increase the nation's wealth, hasten the golden age of government. In other words, it was a messianic vision of these reforming women that, they didn't win the right to vote in 1896. They had to wait until 1911, when the progressive era changed the whole feeling of government in California, and the effort to reform government. It was at that time that there were many reform elements introduced onto the ballot. The recall was passed into law, the referendum, the initiative, and the right of women to vote, 1911. And at the same time, direct primaries and prohibition in Santa Clara County followed not too long after that. And then the restriction of immigration. This was the time in which the restriction of Asian immigration reached its height. It would culminate in about 1922. So all of these threads came together in the election of 1911. And I guess I would like to mention two women who had tremendous part in working on that 1911 election, very local women. One, there's another lady I can't help mentioning, Miss Severance of Palo Alto, who had revitalized the old suffrage club and got them all moving, and she has come down in history as having said, there were no laggards among us. They all worked hard, in other words, to get the vote. But the two women I want to emphasize, one is Sophia Durst of Sunnyvale. She was president of the Sunnyvale Women's Club, and she was given special mention in the reports that I read. And here's what it was said about her. She has probably reached more people and made more converts than any other person in the county. She's spoken at Gilroy, Morgan Hill, Mountain View, Santa Clara, the mills and the tanneries, Milliken's Corners, it's Lawrence Station, El Camino, the Willows. She's done precinct work in Gilroy and Rucker, which is a little town in South County, no longer exists in South County, San Jose, Santa Clara, Mayfield, and Los Altos. Attended by her gifted son and daughter. And the others that helped in this election were Stanford students and Stanford professors. Now, there are, the last woman I want to mention in this area was Mrs. Elizabeth Lowe Watson, who lived not more than a half mile from where we are now. She came to the county in 1880. She'd also been a public speaker, a preacher, who had her own congregation in San Francisco, and in 1910 and 11 she was president of the State Suffrage Society. And her route into the question of suffrage was also through temperance and through her concern for peace. So she had, I think, an incredible influence in working with the precincts of the whole of California and establishing them and getting them to work so that the vote was brought out. Now, I just have a few more minutes I'd like to spend. I know that we have reached the end of the hour, but there were other women. You see, 1911 did not mark the end of the effort to get the vote, because California had the vote, but it was not yet a federal right. And so a whole new group of people came on the scene, of which there were some locally that should be mentioned. One was Alice Locke Clark, who worked with the American Peace Society, but she was also an international speaker on behalf of women's rights. And Sarah Bard Field Wood is a very interesting local character. She bridges the gap from the 19th century women she's definitely a 20th century person. We'll say about her that in 1915 there was a new suffrage group called the Congressional Union, And their ambition was to get the federal vote, and they organized, and they're headed up by Alice Paul. And Sarah Barfield Wood had already been involved in the suffrage effort, traveling from coast to coast and speaking to groups all over the area. She was a poet, and as well as a suffrage worker. And the thing that stands out as one of the dramatic gestures of that period that showed this women on the move, she and another woman got into a car, an open car, and made a special flag-stop journey across the United States with a petition of thousands of names, which they presented to the steps of Congress on behalf of women's right to vote. This was in 1915. Other women who, I guess, if one were to look at the ordinary women of the valley, what were they doing? I mean, not everybody was of this class that I have been describing to you. There were a lot of farm people having to work in their lives to make a living for their families, and they didn't really have the time to do this. And we have some interesting journals of the time, and they depict a very quiet type of life. But in this case, Mrs. Sophia Crefeld Garrett recorded in her journal of January the 10th, 1912, how Vince, her son, drove Hazel with the daughter to the Saratoga Depot. The Garrett family, by the way, still has the property of the Garrett stables up off Monument Road. And her son took the daughter to Santa Fe to register at the court. Hazel Bell Garrett, age 21, height 5 feet 4.5 inches, was the first to register from Cupertino District to vote as a woman. So she put that in her journal. I thought it was interesting. It depicts a life, however, of quiet pleasures. I went over to the Laylors. I took 6 eucalyptus trees and gave them. I had a cup of tea, and I quite enjoyed myself. We spent a pleasant evening at home, reading and writing. I wrote to Hazel and Mrs. Wickham. It's that kind of quiet life that was going on in the out country, so to speak, because this really was in the country. But she mentioned several times how tired she felt from the work. I felt so tired, I just cried and rested. A lonely day. Vince was pruning cots. I still feel tired, but did my work, and Vince and I, after dinner, got ready to go to church. Contrast to this kind of life, now I'm coming down to the very end. I just have 2 more situations I want to explain to you, because it will give you a better view of the whole spectrum of Santa Clara County women and their history. Just a kind of a brief. There was a very fine woman doctor in Palo Alto, Dr. Edith Eugenie Johnson. She came to Stanford in 1907 and was the doctor for the female students at campus, and then she opened her own practice. And over the next 50 years, she delivered 3,500 babies, 50 of whom were named after her. She lived to be over 90 years old, and it's an interesting kind of counter to the whole stream I've been talking about. She particularly aided and helped the Asians among the population, the Chinese and the Japanese, who were so poor that many of them could not pay for the delivery of their babies. And she apologizes at the beginning of her journal, the leaves from a doctor's diary published in 1954. She says, if more space has been allotted to the underprivileged than to others, it is because more things happen to them. And one story that she tells is particularly sad, of a young Mexican woman who at 14 fell in love with a good-looking Mexican twice her age, and the mother and the priest connived to get them married, she said, to make an honest woman of her and get a name for the baby. Now this is quoted from her journal. By the time she was 26 years old, and she had acquired syphilis and 8 children, 3 of whom had syphilis. There might have been more children, but for the fact that the husband periodically deserted his wife and remained away for months at a time, leaving his family to be supported by the county and kindly neighbors. After the birth of the 8th child, the mother became a mental case and was sent to the insane asylum, where she remained until she died. 3 children were sent to the Catholic Relief Home. Of the 4 or 5, I think, that were sent to the Catholic Relief Home, 3 died from diphtheria. The latest news of the little girl who was given a name for the marriage of her parents was that she was sent to a home for delinquent girls. The moral of this tale, to go on with Dr. Johnson's journal, is there is always a question whether one should encourage a girl to marry a man who's not only unwilling but definitely unfit to take on the duties of a parent. If Mary had been sent to a Salvation Army home or some other home where girls in trouble are cared for, it would have been better for everyone concerned. The last woman I just want to introduce to you briefly, and then I'll end, is a revolutionary woman who came out of Santa Clara County's history, Elizabeth Nicholas, who very well may still be alive. I haven't been able to locate her, but she was still alive about 4 years ago when she was interviewed. She came to Santa Clara County in 1922 when she was 17. In other words, she was born in 1905. And her mother had died. She was Yugoslavian, the whole family was. And it was she, as the eldest of the children, of 6 other children, that assumed the role of mother. And she, of course, also had to work in the cannery to help support the family. Her father worked as probably a fruit picker, and she worked in the cannery and began immediately to organize women against the conditions of the cannery. So we find her at the age, 10 years later, say in the 30s, in the depths of the Depression, leading protests against cannery conditions. And what she did was, with others, to try and coordinate the workers to strike the canneries on behalf of higher wages. As she says in her interview, wages were lower. This is 1931. And we were asked to work longer hours. In 1931, men were working for 25 cents an hour, and women were getting anywhere from 15 to 25. The pressure was terrific on them. I mean, he really worked hard, so that it was just when we began to talk about organizing. Early in 1930, in 1 or 2 canneries, we happened to get enough people interested. Eventually, we relayed our base. And she goes on to say, there was a rally in San Jose at St. James Square. We managed on August the 1st of that day to call a strike. I think we had every cannery shut down tight. No new worker came to work that day. Miss Minna Parsons, another revolutionary from San Francisco, a noted labor speaker from the Needle Traders Union, was there to address the crowd, 3,000 to 5,000 cannery workers in the square. Before she could speak, the tear gas came out and bedlam broke loose. A couple of hand grenades were thrown at her. One hit her in the face and knocked her off the platform. Bedlam broke. We wanted to get her out of there, which we did, and got her out at the center of the city. When I got back into town, we arrested about 60 people. I don't know exactly what happened after that because we were taken to jail. When I started for jail, which was the old city hall, they had every fire engine around the jail, and they were washing the streets in all directions, and they put us in jail. Well, that was the break. That particular 1931 effort did not create the union that they hoped to, but she led and was involved in the 15 strike efforts, and by 1937 the unions did have, the unions were organized in Santa Clara County. So I think I've given you some broad idea of the force of energy that women in Santa Clara County have had and the different ways in which they have expressed. We can summarize the dream. While they have all wanted to be treated equally, they wanted the kind of respect that they felt was due to them for various reasons. I think there were several dreams, there wasn't one. They shared some things in common. And I feel it's been a real pleasure to do this research and prepare it for you. Before I open to questions, there are a few women here I'd like to make known to you as sort of pioneers themselves. One of the women who's helped me enormously in the research, Audrey Butcher, would you stand up? Generations in the United States and in Santa Clara County. And in many ways, I was telling Audrey's history, I think. I'm not sure. In the back, Janet Lewis, one of our noted Santa Clara County writers, is with us today. Francis Fox, one of our famous Santa Clara County historians. Her attention as a historian to the history of women in Santa Clara County and wrote a very excellent paper. Now, we do have some time. If you'd like to break and then come back, or go and get some coffee and come back. If you have any questions, I'd be very happy to engage you and have a discussion. We do have some time left for questions. Yes, I see a hand here somewhere. be bashful, ignored it.
I didn't realize how much they thought the suffrage would bring people.
Yeah, the connection between the women's movement, for instance, Elizabeth Lowe Watson, her whole life was dedicated in pursuit of peace. You know, she came here to Santa Clara County in 1880 and was already a leader in the peace movement. And she was a minister, preacher, and that really was her first love. Her second love was suffrage.
It's a dream that did not come around.
Right.